Okay, this video is not going to be about organized stalking or targeted individuals, and while I will bring up the topic occasionally throughout the video, it's only as a reference because I would expect people who don't know a lot about that issue to watch this video because, why not, right? And because that pertains to my story, I'll mention it a few times just as an explanation. But no, this video is going to be about psychological issues, and as the title suggests, undiagnosed autism. So if you're not interested in that, you may as well click off. You won't find this video very entertaining or informative. For the rest, though, for those of you who are here because you read the title and you wanna hear what I have to say about autism. Undiagnosed autism is a failure of the mental health system. And I'm just going to read what I wrote because this is going to be long. In this video, I hope to explain with as much accuracy as possible, given the situation, the qualities and traits I exhibit that have led me to believe that I have undiagnosed autism. I think my mother might as well. The problem is that I can't put all of the information out there, as some of it is extremely personal. Much of the information that I am withholding is unfortunately the stamp on the envelope, so to speak. It tells the rest of the story and puts everything into perspective. That said, what you hear in this video is only part of the story. While this isn't a professional presentation, I am putting this out there for the benefit of other people who might have undiagnosed autism. I'm also putting this out there for legitimate mental health professionals who are honest enough to seek the truth, wise enough to know when they see it, and have a desire to help others who might be suffering, which, that is your job, right? Because I have left out important information, again, this isn't the whole story. If anyone wants to contact me for further information, please do so with caution. There's no guarantee I'll receive your comment or request, and there's no guarantee that if you get a response, it is from me. For those of you who are unaware of what's been going on, you just clicked on this title because it's related to something you were interested in. After a fight online with two psychopaths, one of whom doxed me, meaning they released my personal information to the public, people started targeting me in real life, Zerzet Sung style. Because of that, all of my channels of communication have been compromised. That said, unless I can be sure that you're a legitimate professional from a legitimate practice, I will refrain from giving out personal information. If you are legitimate, maybe we can do a video conference. That way you'll know for sure that you're actually talking to me. Although we can expect that to be listened to too, also, but anyway. It's also because of this issue, that the stalking campaign against me, that I can't seek real professional help with the diagnosis of autism, as in our current climate, I, like so many others, am more likely to receive a false diagnosis, possibly even accusations of illegal drug use. Paranoid delusions and drug use seem to be the common go-to explanation for everything nowadays, especially those things that are otherwise difficult to understand. Since the stalking issue is going to come up at some point, I would rather not risk seeking a proper diagnosis out of fear of receiving a false diagnosis instead. This is dangerous. Once a stalking victim is deemed paranoid or delusional, he or she will not be taken seriously when he or she goes for help, whether to a doctor or law enforcement. I can't risk that. In fact, after I told my doctor a little bit about what was happening, she had me do a drug test. Anyway, there's so much more information out there now on autism, especially high-functioning autism, and I feel that my case would be beneficial for purposes of research. And I think it's a shame that I can't do this legitimately or professionally. All that said, I've spoken quite a bit on this channel about the disastrous consequences of being falsely diagnosed with the mental disorder. What I haven't spoken much about is the likewise devastating consequences of being improperly diagnosed, meaning being given a false diagnosis instead of an accurate one. This happens quite often in regard to autistic adults whose condition was often overlooked and even misdiagnosed as another disorder in childhood or later in life. I'm old. When I was a child, there was a very stringent view of what autism looked like, and children who didn't present in a classic manner were typically diagnosed with other disorders, oftentimes leading to extreme social isolation and lifelong struggle, as certain disorders, if considered to be volatile enough, would indeed create hostility toward the child in others who had been informed of the child's disorder, or in this case, the false diagnosis. As for teenagers and adults, failure to properly diagnose autism can even lead to false accusations of drug use later in life when their seemingly odd behavior is looked upon with suspicion. Not to mention, an autistic adult or teen might be accused of engaging in poor or even illegal behavior, simply due to certain behaviors that the population is conditioned to see as signs of guilt or signs of lying, such as extreme anxiety when questioned and failure to make eye contact. Okay, someone who's fidgety and looking down and stuttering, right? People see that as a sign of guilt. Imagine someone is nervous, all right? He or she might have a hard time explaining himself. He looks anxious and isn't making eye contact. He looks guilty. Now consider someone with the more severe form of autism being stopped by the cops. I don't think I have to explain how quickly this can become deadly, especially here in America, in the United States. Right, this is serious. This is deadly serious. In fact, I think there have been a few cases already of an autistic young man, one or two autistic young men who were killed by the cops. And in Australia, I think there was a woman who was who was having a meltdown, and she also was killed by a cop, or New Zealand or somewhere. Anyway, misdiagnosis. Now back to the past, though. We're looking at a historical record here. Misdiagnosis happened to both boys and girls, though it happened to girls more often, as years ago, high-functioning autism or Asperger's syndrome was thought to be a condition suffered only by boys. Girls were not diagnosed with autism unless they were truly severely developmentally impaired, meaning autistic in the most extreme way. And so girls who suffered from a milder form of autism, such as high-functioning autism or Asperger's, were overlooked, and it was assumed they had other problems, such as psychological, as opposed to neurological. Although that's not to say that autistics can't also have psychological problems. Of course they can. There's anxiety, there's depression, there's a lot that goes along with this, or can go along with it. And even though in reality girls did suffer from high-functioning autism, what used to be referred to as Asperger's, autistic girls in general tended to present with different symptoms than those presented in boys, than those boys used to present with. These symptoms were thus attributed to different and oftentimes serious mental disorders. Many girls were wrongfully diagnosed with psychiatric disorders that often left them alienated and isolated due to the stigma surrounding such. And that happens to boys too. Right? If they're diagnosed with a horrible, psychiatric disorder, something terrible, there's a stigma around that. Nowadays, that stigma is even worse as the government has become involved, and a diagnosis will follow a person throughout his or her life. Right, but back to the old days for a moment. In both cases, for boys and girls, an improper diagnosis often led to a lifetime of unnecessary suffering, or at least an unnecessary increase in suffering. Not only might they have been diagnosed with a serious mental disorder that is extremely unflattering to one's character, other people who were unaware of their real illness would have treated them horribly simply due to a lack of understanding of the way they really worked, or the way their mind really worked. If they had been properly diagnosed as children, not only would the adults around them have been made aware of how they ticked mentally, and thus might have shown more understanding, the children themselves would have grown up with a better understanding of their own self, as opposed to simply being taught that there was something horribly wrong with them, something terrible, that warrants caution, fear, and whispers among others, something that they need to push down and change in order to be a proper member of society. They would have understood what was really wrong with them and why they were the way they were. For the boys, they would have understood that they weren't just bad or violent by nature, or likely to become a psychotic murderer in the future as they get older, right? And just imagine the adults who are informed of a child's diagnosis, in a diagnosis like that. right, or false diagnosis like that, they almost certainly would have treated the child differently, in many cases with hostility. Girls could also be deemed a potential threat or a potential future threat. Many of the perceived negative character traits in girls were based on social interactions, meaning their inability to interact in a way that was considered proper and expected. It's the same for boys in that case, but more attention, more focus was put on the inability of girls to be what they were supposed to be societally. And just a side note, in the old days, long before autism was known about, all right, and certainly long before autism in girls was known about, but even autism in general, long before it was even heard of, many of the character traits that we now associate with autism in girls would result in women being lobotomized in order to normalize them. And I have normalized in quotes, in order to quote unquote normalize them. Anyway, back to here we go. For the girls, especially, the women now who grew up this way and they grew up with autism, but they were never properly diagnosed. If only they had known the truth, they would have understood that they weren't just, whatever character traits these women get called, right? Whether it's frigid, cold, selfish, uncaring, unloving, controlling, obsessive, hysterical, psychotic, whatever it is. And then of course, I'm sure they were told that their social problems were due to all of those horrible traits, right? Girls were socialized and expected to be sociable, giving, outwardly caring, warm, polite, adaptable, agreeable, not exactly traits that are compatible with autism, with autism. Just to note, women with autism tend to have a higher history of severe childhood bullying by both boys and girls, and that includes physical violence by both. They also have a higher suicide rate. When it comes to autism in women, I made a huge mistake here as well. While reading through the list of symptoms of autistic women, I noticed that my mother exhibited many of the listed symptoms. She's extremely sensitive to stimuli, light, sound, taste, and touch. She doesn't eat anything new or that has certain textures or flavors. She's hard to shop and to cook for, which makes dealing with this during a pandemic very difficult since I'm the one who's taking care of her. She constantly pulls at the clothing she is wearing, adjusting and readjusting, especially around the collar. She is picky about anything that is a little uncomfortable and seems to think that just about everything is uncomfortable. If I do laundry and the clothing is just a tiny bit even chilly from the air conditioning in the hallway, she'll throw it back into the dirty clothes, which makes more work for me, right? She also hoards, she possibly has OCD and she has cognitive problems. Now I think back to all of the times that I became angry with her for her behavior or for being extremely difficult, and I kick myself for it. If only I had known the truth. I can't even count the number of times I broke down shouting and begging her to tell me why she is the way she is, and why she does this and why she does that. I've even called her selfish and cruel, though she's neither. She's a kind, caring woman. But she does these things and has these ways that can seem incredibly... I've called her selfish, and she's not. For example, refusing to eat what we have, which forced me even before the pandemic to go out and, it forced me before the pandemic to go out and to get her something else, only to have her find an excuse to refuse to eat. Let me restart this. For example, refusing to eat what we have, which forced me before the pandemic anyway, to go out and get her something else, only to have her find an excuse to refuse that food as well. Once I went out close to midnight to try to find her something to eat, something that she said she wanted, and when I got back, she picked at it and threw most of it away because something was wrong with it. Okay, there's always something that seems to be wrong with it, and with everything, and this puts a lot of strain on me. Even a piece of lettuce out of place or an olive that has a shape that she believes is not quite right, and now the entire thing becomes unedible in her mind. This is harder now during the pandemic when I can't just run around from place to place and find her something that she'll eat. And I mentioned this before, after I do laundry, sometimes she'll throw clean clothing right back into the laundry bag to be washed again. It was clean, but maybe it was a little cold from the air conditioning in the hallway, and she thinks it's damp, thus it's dirty in her mind, thus it goes back into the dirty clothing. A good many of the times I wash, a good many of the items I wash for her end up right back in the dirty clothing bag within an hour for irrational reasons. I can't stand irrationality. I can't stand it. This and so much more has driven me crazy for years. I'm tired. But now that I know this could be more than just her being picky and difficult, to an absurd degree, I feel terrible for becoming so angry and even mean at times. For the men and women who were diagnosed as adults, it must have been bittersweet, and I mean diagnosed with autism. On one hand, to look back at the hardships they've suffered and they've had to endure throughout their lives, and to see how mean some people might have been to them because they didn't understand their behavior, and to know that much of that could have been avoided if only they had been properly diagnosed, must be maddening. On the other hand, they finally have answers. They finally know why they are the way they are, that they aren't just bad by nature, they're not just these horrible monsters that they grew up believing they were, and that there are many others out there just like them. What a relief that must be. Years ago, while, while re- years ago, while researching psychological disorders, I spent some time learning about autism, and I've spent my life learning about psychology. I've always been interested in this, but autism was never really something I focused on because that's more neurological. But years ago, while researching psychological disorders, I did start reading about autism as well. Some of the characteristics seemed very similar to my own, though eventually I let it go. And I did think at first, could I have this? But no, I let it go. I figured if I hadn't been diagnosed as a child, I probably wasn't autistic because the book says it's normally diagnosed in children, right? At least that's what the book used to say. But recently I've taken another look at the research, especially new research, that has come out on autism. It appears that there are many adults who have been diagnosed late in life after having been falsely diagnosed as a child and even as a young adult with numerous other mental disorders. Reading through the updated list of symptoms felt like looking at my own profile. Someone could have literally written that about me. It was a little unnerving reading such an accurate description of myself in a report on a neurological disorder. This information had been out for years. Now, if this information had been out for years, I would have known years ago what was wrong with me, instead of deeming it invalid because I had not yet been diagnosed. It's striking how many autistic traits I exhibited as a child and still do as an adult. Though from my teenage years on, it could have been hidden by my own behavior. On one hand, despite developmental disorders and poor motor skills, I think that's what I had, poor motor skills and other developmental issues. I did start reading earlier than most children. I had a higher than average reading level for my age, and from what I remember, I scored relatively high in areas of standardized testing that involved reading, comprehension skills, and language, or something like that. I don't remember exactly because it was so long ago. On the other hand, I skipped school to the point of truancy, and my grades suffered simply because I wasn't there. And on the rare occasion where I actually showed up, I was too anxious to pay attention in class and spent most of my time hiding out in the bathroom in order to avoid bullies. I spent lunch in the library. In fact, I spent most of my time in the library, most of my free time anyway. That way I can hide and read, right? The point is that even though I was a high achiever in some areas, it wasn't reflected in my academic performance. Well, except for one time, a program called DARE. It was a program to keep kids off drugs. They held a writing contest at our school, and I won. I won a stuffed animal, a stuffed Dare Bear. Unfortunately, my beloved dog at the time chewed it up a few weeks later. I would also mask certain traits that I knew brought condemnation from others. First off, since I never did understand or like the latest fashions, I started to copy others in order to dress in a manner that was more socially acceptable. On my own, I was clueless as to why people liked or disliked certain items of clothing, or why one item had to match another, and so on. I didn't understand it. It didn't mean anything to me. I knew but I did know that I knew when I finally got it right, because if I did, I was left alone and not condemned for what I was wearing. Maybe too, since I didn't pay attention to certain gender stereotypes, my rather androgynous appearance triggered the wrong type of people. It can trigger animosity in the wrong people. I never did understand why people fixate so much on unimportant issues. I was worried about my I was worried about how my mom would cover the mortgage and whether or not she would have to take a second job because my dad died when I was very young, so she was a single mother. Right? She had to work sometimes two jobs, and usually one, but sometimes two. And as a child, I always feared she would have to get a second job. The other kids were worried about but the other kids, they were worried about someone's clothing not matching, or a boy not looking manly enough, or a girl not looking feminine enough, right? Incidentally, though, by the age of 13, I had already started to develop facial hair. Other ways of masking. I tried to fit in as best I could by watching other people, their mannerisms, or paying attention to their speech, and the tone of their voice as they would speak, in order to copy whatever appeared to be normal behavior, and in that manner to avoid bringing condemnation onto myself. Occasionally it worked for a while, but it never lasted. I always reverted back to my own self, with all my quirks and my tics, and my stuttering. If you stutter, those of you who stutter know that it can be hard not to. And all of this, reverting back to my old self, seemed to piss people off, and even frighten them at some point. But what could I do? You can only put on an act for so long. It's exhausting and infuriating. At some point, you just want to be left to live in peace, especially when you're not hurting anyone. This is just me. It's just how I am. I know some people disapprove, and I never understood why, since I'm not hurting anyone. Can someone really be so controlling and insecure that failing to make eye contact, or that failing to make and hold eye contact with them during a conversation would really piss them off that much? I mean, come on. I am listening, even if I'm not looking directly at you. As for the way that I dress, I wear what I find comfortable, regardless of fashion. So what if my clothing doesn't fit a certain stupid dogma? I'm not hurting anyone. And just a side note, I'm completely celibate. I've had sex once in my life. Once, and I don't plan to do it again. I'm not even engaging in what some would believe to be, any kind of sexual immorality. Some of the people pointing their finger at me for whatever they see as my own improper demeanor, whatever that is, whatever they consider that to be. Many of those people are themselves worse sinners than I am. I've told more than one person to look in the damn mirror if they want to point their finger, at someone, especially at me, or at a so-called sinner, right? And it's hard because when I converted to Christianity, I converted in a Baptist church. But now I have no community. There's nowhere I belong, especially since, and I know another target also pointed this out, and she's right, Baptists can be incredibly judgmental. It's hard. It's very hard. But I digress. To a certain extent, I still mask my own quirky and awkward character traits. And I try to limit small talk to a few sentences. As hard as it is to pretend all the time, it's still easier than wondering why someone just became so upset, or what caused them to go from laughing with me to looks of anger and disgust, literally within a split second. I spent my entire childhood and adolescence trying to figure out what was wrong with me, how I could change it, and what it would take to just be normal. I had to fake a lot, and it was exhausting. As if faking normalcy wasn't hard enough, I had to try and control my very physical behaviors that I knew both irritated and angered people. I knew they hated when they thought I didn't give them the proper respect or attention, so I learned to force myself to look them in the eye, even though it was uncomfortable for me to do. The trouble is that the angrier and more forceful they became, the harder it was for me to look them in the eye or stop fidgeting around, as if I was trying to twist and turn right out of my body, to squirm away from them, to squirm away from their anger and their gaze. More than once, when I worked downtown, my boss came really close, angrily leaned over me, fist clenched and within inches of my face, and demanded that I look at him, right before shouting, "Did you hear me?" I can't count how many times he shouted at me, look at me. I was paying attention. I just don't tend to look at people right in the face, right in the eyes, right? Having him shout in my face while clenching his fist and flaring his nostrils happened relatively frequently in that office. I mean, he shouted at a lot of people, but he took most of his anger out on me. My nature, when confronted with such treatment, is to first squirm, look down, look away, get away. I just want to get away from the person. It almost makes me want to claw right out of my skin. And if getting away isn't possible, instinct is to lash back and attempt to physically remove the person from my space. At one point, it got so bad that I bolted up from my chair and took a step toward him with my own clenched fists. He backed off really quick at that point. But there's no way to win here. Because he never physically assaulted me, I would have been arrested if I so much as touched him, which I didn't. And on the other hand, if I had to break down and started screaming at him to get the F away from me, I would have been deemed crazy or worse. All I could do in most cases was just shut up and take it. In most cases, I did. This led to a certain level of dissociation, and I don't mean dissociation in terms of multiple personalities. No. What I mean is I would simply detach, almost leave my body and watch as an observer. I would numb myself. It was the only way I could deal. When someone is that close and behaving in such a volatile manner, fight or flight takes over. If I can't flee, the next desire is to fight. And if neither of those options is possible, it is at that point that I start to shut down and it really melt down. And I shut off. I shut off, and then they're just bringing me back. They're shouting at me, and eventually I melt down. And I think other autistics might understand this. You know that point when someone has been screaming in your face for so long that you start to dissociate, but zoning out only makes them shout even louder and get even closer in order to force your attention back to them. That's my meltdown point. Unfortunately, this attempt to get away in any manner possible only exacerbated the traits that angered him so much to begin with. I withdrew even more, head down, no eye contact, not quite there, and so on. Needless to say, that job did not end well. In fact, one of my coworkers ended up running out of the office crying hysterically, leaving me to deal with the fury of this asshole, which at that point became solely directed at me. I quit the same evening. He, my former boss, was almost as bad as this woman who used to shout and screech at me, to the point where I almost ended up huddled on the floor, head in hands, rocking back and forth. I couldn't stand being watched or stared at, and would have an instinctive drive to flee when I felt too many eyes on me. It's a horrible feeling, really. I'm still like that, which makes the stalking campaign even worse. Years ago, while I was working in corporate America, I wrote a short story about thousands of eyes being on me. That was before the fight online and before the stalking campaign that came after that fight. Right? That was even before this started, the organized stalking started, or at least before I was aware that it started. Now I'm literally having one meltdown after another. It's horrible, right? I completely shut off and break down just thinking about the psychopaths watching me 24/7, especially when I'm out and they flip their camera up at me, and then they grin and smirk. But eventually I pull myself together and find a way to exist. What other choice do I have, Now some people might say, well then, why are you giving them more ideas on how to screw with you? But the truth is, it isn't about the common perpetrators. It's about the organizers of this type of warfare, this psyop, psychological warfare. And they already know what makes me tick. They already know what sets me off. Besides, if they provoke again in public, they'll just end up giving me more footage as evidence. Remember, I record now. But back to masking, or hiding my own character traits that seem to piss people off. I've always tried to hide something that when referring to autism is called stimming, or self-stimulatory behavior. And don't worry, it's not as weird as it sounds. Well, it's weird, it's just not in that way. As a child, I learned to stop, or at least to try to stop, my excessive tapping and pounding because I knew that it irritated, it pissed people off. Though I oftentimes failed and only realized that I had been tapping again when someone chastised me for it. Sometimes that tapping turned into outright pounding or drumming on everything. I liked rhythm too. Sometimes I would tap or pound in rhythm. At one point, it was suggested that I might have ADHD. Even as a young adult, I would often tap on hard objects by habit, only to be scolded by others around me. Nowadays, when I'm at the doctor's office, in order to avoid being labeled with a horrible mental disorder that I don't have, I've tried to control my hand movements. I've tried to control my hand movements. I have this finger tap that I do, which is different than the tapping on objects. I tap my thumb against each finger. 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And then back in the opposite direction. I do it almost unconsciously or when I'm under a lot of stress. The perpetrators also started copying me, though in a more exaggerated manner. They would have someone walk by me and do the exact same thing in order to make me self-conscious by showing me my behavior, only, again, in a more exaggerated way. They really did make it seem crazy, the way they did it. Now that I've tried to control it when I go out, and even in the apartment, they also seem to have decreased that specific form of mimicking. Though since we've been on lockdown, I've noticed that as I pace back and forth, I'm doing it again. So once I finally leave the building, they'll probably start mimicking me again in that manner. And also note, I did go out on Friday, but since I went out with a friend who gave me a ride, I wasn't on the bus and I wasn't exposed to the perpetrators as to the extent that I would be, if I had to take the bus. So even though there were a few of these Eastern European guys, following us around and, they didn't really have a chance to do a lot. Okay, sensory issues. I'm going to start talking faster because this video is getting longer and I know I'm going to run out of storage. Sensory issues, including sensory overload. This is difficult to describe. I hear things louder, see things brighter. I can't sleep if there's even a little light in the room. Sudden noises startle me. I don't like to be touched. It feels like being zapped with little electrodes. I was like that as a child too. I would just say, I would scream at people not to touch me. It's as if I can feel people's energy closing in on me. And I don't mean in a supernatural way. It's very physical. Too much commotion, be it visual, audio, physical, or people just flitting around me, feels like being swarmed by buzzing, stinging bees. Or maybe like being in one of those rooms with walls that keep moving closer and closer together until the person inside is crushed. This is what makes organized stalking especially difficult. Their agenda is to drive the target to a breakdown by overloading him or her with negative stimuli. This is much easier to do if the target was already extremely sensitive to external stimuli. So they attack, they provoke, on and off, day and night. I tell myself that I'm going to ignore it, but the truth is, ignoring it doesn't make it go away. It doesn't make it easier for me. In fact, it makes them try even harder to get my attention. The pressure just keeps building until at 3 a.m. there's a thump, thump, thump on the ceiling right above me, or someone comes and physically pounds on the door and runs off, and I end up having a very loud meltdown, at which point the neighbors complain. As a child, I would stay, moving on, as a child, I would stay in my room a lot, or in a room at someone else's house in order to avoid this negative effect of sensory overload and also to avoid social interaction. I was more comfortable alone, though I always wanted to have at least one friend to hang out with. And I should have added this earlier, but another sensory issue is with clothing. My mother, she's sensitive to clothing too. I kind of am as well. I only wear comfortable clothing. Having to wear something uncomfortable, especially if it has lots of parts to bother with, will always drive me crazy. I'm not exactly GQ material. And on that same note, I am not fashion conscious. I don't particularly care what other people wear either. Though when I see someone wearing something that looks extremely uncomfortable, it does make me uncomfortable. It's almost a cringe factor, because I can imagine how uncomfortable the other person must be. For example, when I see men in ties, I have an immediate desire to pull my own shirt collar to loosen it. And my God, when I see, a woman in a skirt, tights, high heels, long, with long press-on nails, that must hinder daily activity. It, 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 it almost makes me panic. I'm socially awkward, clueless even. There were times when I did try to fit in, especially in my teens or as a young adult when I had a corporate job, but my attempt to appear normal always failed, as I never understood group dynamics or the unspoken rules that govern all social interactions. There always seemed to be something wrong with me. I would say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing. I was just wrong, though I never understood why. I would offend someone without trying to or wanting to. I didn't respond to verbal or nonverbal cues the way people expected or thought I should because I didn't understand what they wanted from me or expected of me. I wasn't trying to be insolent, offensive, or disrespectful, and I certainly wasn't trying to hurt feelings. Later in life, though, especially when the abuse really picked up in '07 or '08, I did develop a bit of an edge and stopped worrying so much about offending others. In fact, it isn't inaccurate to say that I became quite mean. I had people I didn't even know following me around, mocking me, getting in my face, pointing me out to others, only to have those people look back at me and join in with the group. People would shove me in the store and sometimes throw things out of their car at me. I was in awe at how many people were recruited into this rabid pack of cowardly predators to gather together against one lone target who had no way of fighting back. I was horrified. Even before I learned about organized stalking, I figured these uncivilized savages were friends and social media contacts of the two psychopaths I got into an argument with online, because that's when it started, after that argument online, or at least that's when it appeared to have started. It got so bad that I didn't have to say or do anything in order to earn someone else's contempt. They hated me, and I had no clue why or even who they were. I could be sitting in an office building, two people would get into a fight with each other, and in anger, one would throw something at me after looking at me with rage, as if I had done something. We didn't even know each other. They just hated me so much, the very sight of me, that I was the one they threw things at or kicked when they got angry. But then it wasn't just the sight of me. Now I know they were clearly part of a group that was being lied to. The smear campaign was at maximum force at that point, and I wasn't even aware of it. Although, I knew I was treated badly, but I just didn't know there was a campaign this massive against me. The worsening attacks finally got to me, and all I wanted was to be allowed to live in peace. Of course, I didn't know that such a thing would never be allowed. Even when the stalking campaign started, I might have gotten their social net. I assumed it, even when the stalking campaign started, I assumed it would stop at some point. Remember, I thought that it started with two people online who might have gotten their social networking buddies involved, or maybe some military buddies. I never imagined a massive organized campaign that would consume my life as it has the lives of so many others, and that I would never again be allowed to live in peace, even if I did manage to figure out how to interact with others in a manner that appears normal. Depending on when the stalking campaign actually started, much of the abuse I endured over the years might have been related to the psyop or the psychological operation, and not to any animosity I brought on myself due to my own lack of interpersonal skills, though my failure to socialize normally or to pick up on verbal and nonverbal cues from others most certainly led to the success of the smear campaign against me, and it made it easier for people to believe whatever lies were being told. They just really hated me, without even knowing it. On more than one occasion, I've had someone who I know relatively well, look at me, shake his or her head, and mumble something like, "How can someone so smart be so stupid at the same time?" Not such a terrible comment compared to the men and women who have called me retarded and freak. And then, of course, the groups, the herds they're with laugh along with them. And now I know that this, too, is common among other men and women with autism. And in the old building, there was this immensely cruel woman who took special interest in tormenting me every chance she got. Every time I saw her, she had something negative to say about me, or to me, or she would scowl and hiss and react as if I had said or done something horrible, though I said and did nothing. At the very least, she would sneer at me whenever we passed each other, and I wasn't allowed to respond. Dare I respond in any manner, she would become even more irate. One day by the elevator, she ran up quickly, almost out of nowhere, and startled me. I startle pretty easily. Loud noises or someone coming up out of nowhere is something that the organized stalkers have perfected because they know it will make me jump. Well, I jumped. I was not rude. I did not even show anger. But she got angry. She called me a freak. And not the first time she did that, and then started to mock me, as she loudly and with over-exaggerated movements copied my actions. She made it seem like I had screamed, flailed my arms all around, jumped up and down, contorted my face, and worse, which is all of it was untrue. Her overly exaggerated impression of me was hideous. Right? I did none of those things. From that moment on, I had to walk on eggshells around her and try to avoid even flinching, as she demeaned and degraded me. She was one of those irrational lunatics who can be as nasty to others as she wants, but then gets angry if they so much as frown in response. Now I still have to work extra hard to control my reactions, right down to my facial expressions, because there are people whose sole job it is to provoke me, only to then use my response against me. I can't say that I perfected the art of not flinching, but I am learning and struggling to keep a straight face despite the provocations, though there have been times in the recent past where I did break down and scream at someone to get the F away from me. This usually happens when they take out their cell phone camera and clearly record me, or they make a nasty comment under their breath. Not only do they do it, they want me to know they're doing it, and then they grin and smirk when I get angry. Moving on. We're going to move on now. I'm going to try to do this quickly. Just a side note, just to include this before I forget it, I've always loved animals, dogs and cats, but dogs in particular seem to have a calming effect on me. When I was a child and close to breaking down, my mom would often bring our dog over to me because she knew that within minutes I would have calmed down, at least somewhat. Um, I'm really more comfortable with I'm more comfortable with animals than with people. Moving on, obsessions. As a child, I would form obsessions, and again, this is another autistic trait, with certain objects, subjects, ideas, or even on occasion people, real or fictional. When focused on my current obsession, my attention was so completely directed at whatever it was that I oftentimes failed to notice anything going on around me, and that includes people talking to me or trying to get my attention. As a young adult, when I worked in a corporate office, this occasionally led to hurt feelings and even anger and even rage from my boss when I was so engrossed in my work that I failed to notice them, and that they were talking to me. Right? I wasn't intentionally ignoring them. I've always been obsessed with words, or more appropriately, the proper use of words in order to create an accurate depiction of events. I couldn't stand it when words were used to twist facts, distort the truth, or relay an inaccurate version of past occurrences. Um, Irrationality and unreason I could never understand, and it drove me crazy. In my early 20s, I discovered the word verbicide, meaning the deliberate distortion of the sense of a word. I believed at that point that verbicide was the worst crime imaginable. Right? I also hated manipulation to such an extent that I would have meltdowns if my mother or anyone else dared to use such an underhanded tactic in order to win an argument. To this day, I have very little tolerance for those who use manipulation as their main debate strategy. Honestly, it drives me crazy. Though I do remember that as a child, I would come up with any excuse possible in order to justify hiding away in my room, or excusing myself from a group. And while that might have been slightly dishonest, it was a survival/coping mechanism when I could no longer tolerate social interaction. Needless to say, I also had a list of reasons as to why I could not go out with a group. In fact, I've only recently learned that I'm not the only one who actually feels relieved when a group event is canceled. As for numbers are concerned, I'm certainly no mathematician. In fact, I'm terrible with math. Though since childhood I've had a compulsion to add down or reduce groups of numbers to the lowest sum. So, for example, the string of numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 can be reduced to 48, which can then be reduced to 12, and finally to 3. That's what I have to do when I see a group of numbers. And since I'm pretty bad with numbers, this can be quite time-consuming. I honestly certainly would not want to spend a day on Wall Street, surrounded by numbers that keep changing. It's not exactly my idea of fun. And on that note, I've always been uncomfortable with change. I remember back when I was in preschool, my mother came to pick me up after she had gone to the salon. her hairstyle had changed, and it upset me so much that I actually hid in my little cubby. We had little cubbies that for each of us. Yeah, I hid. Also, let's see. The transition between day and night used to make me uneasy. When I was young, I was most anxious around dusk and dawn, though I had no problem with either day or night. Although occasionally I would feel a bit anxious at the prospect of daytime only because it tends to be louder during the day. There's more commotion. I actually feel better at night, though even the quiet of night brings little relief now as the perpetrators interrupt that peace with an occasional thump on the ceiling or bang on our door, letting me know that they're still there. Then there's daily routine. Daily routine is something that for years I didn't realize I followed so stringently. One day a few years ago, after the stalking campaign began, before I learned about organized stalking, I had gone out to get a cup of coffee, and a group of people walked by. One of them looked back at me, laughed, and shouted loudly, something like, "Look who's here again, every day for years doing the same thing, or every day for 20 years doing the same thing." I forget what she said. It was something like that. I don't remember exactly. But it was referring to my doing the same thing every day for years. Up until that point, I didn't even realize that I had a specific routine that I followed almost every day. What I mean is, I knew that I went to the same place at the same time for the exact same type of coffee, rain or shine, almost every day. I just didn't consider that there might be something strange or abnormal about that, or that it was a fixed routine that I followed more out of compulsion or need to stick to the same schedule than a desire for coffee. Now I can see that it was a set routine that I had to engage in, and I remember becoming uncomfortable if I ever had to veer off schedule. After that day, I still occasionally went there to get a cup of coffee, but not as often as I used to. And once the stalking got bad enough, I stopped altogether, really. I stopped doing a lot of things at that point. Emotions. There's a myth that autistic people don't feel emotions or that they're somehow uncaring. This, at least in my case, is untrue, and I'm sure it's true also in the case of other autistic men and women. I don't always express outwardly the emotions that I'm feeling. It doesn't always show on my face, though I do have a hard time hiding pain or feelings of anguish or anger when I'm at the point of meltdown, right? Though I don't express pleasure quite as easily, nor do I always outwardly show concern, though I might be worried about someone. For my lack of response might seem as if I don't care, which is oftentimes the farthest thing from the truth. In fact, I think I might feel distress over another person's distress much more than most people. All right, I think sometimes that I might even be an empath. But as for pleasure or happiness, I might be laughing on the inside, but showing absolutely no outward response. I don't know why this is. It was only within the last year that I really began to understand this as a problem. And even until a week ago, I didn't attribute it to autism. And I know I should have, and I don't know why it didn't click. I've had more than one person ask me why I don't smile. Even my doctor wrote down flat affect, or maybe it was blunted affect. It was one of the two in my online medical chart. And I noticed that when I looked online. I've since made an extra effort to smile and be more expressive when at the doctor's office and with others. I would never have known it. I would never have known. I can't speak. I would never have known if I hadn't seen it written down, even though other people told me. I never assumed that I wasn't expressive enough, even though some people made comments about my lack of expression. And I've now learned that this flat affect is yet one more symptom of autism. And even though I say I've now learned that, but I've read that before, and it never occurred to me. It's not stupidity. I don't know why it never occurred to me. It should have. As far as friends are concerned, I've always had one or two close friends, but friendship here might look a bit differently than it would in normal situations. I don't need to be in contact with someone on and off all day, every day. I'm not chatty. I'm terrible at holding conversations. I don't like talking on the phone, and I don't feel the need to tweet notices of my every move. Of course, I care deeply about those people I consider to be friends, but my distance or need for space might have hurt feelings in the past, and it wasn't my intent. Okay, let's see what else. I'm going to finish this up because we're running out of time. I might have to make 2 videos. As far as imagination, I do have a vivid fantasy life. In fact, I often retreat into my own mind in order to get away from the real world. I kind of hide there in my fantasy world. But I don't act that out in real life. As a child, I wasn't into make-believe play or games that involved pretending. Though I do recall playing lawyer with a boy from down the block. Yeah, other kids played doctor, we played lawyer. But that was rare. When I was very young, I didn't have many female friends because we had so little in common. As I got older, I did have both male and female friends, though I found it difficult to understand the social structure that were created for the girls, that the girls existed within. I do remember having one close female friend, but that ended when she became popular and I didn't. Let's just say once puberty hit, everything went downhill. But right, I was talking about imagination. I like the idea of LARP or live action roleplay, though I would never actually join a group. I'm not good at these things. I'm just not good at it. I'm too awkward in social settings. Even when I was in job training classes, I remember how stupid I felt and how awkward it was when I had to go on mock interviews. Does anyone else remember that? That was terrible. Okay. Though I'm not opposed to all pretend play, I used to play online video games, which I did enjoy, but then I could easily become someone else, hide behind my alt, and interact with people as a hard-hitting, max-level superhero, as opposed to who I really am, a shy, awkward, socially unacceptable weirdo. Plus, it felt good to be able to protect people, to heal them, and yes, to conquer opponents, everything I'm incapable of in real life. Even though it was only pretend, it was therapeutic. There are so many other traits I exhibited both as a child and as an adult that are said to be linked to autism. I won't list them all here, as some are just too personal. What this all leads to, it would be nice to have a diagnosis to finally be able to say, this is it. This is what has been wrong all along. See, I'm not just insert whatever horrible name here. I mean, reading through the signs and symptoms of autism both in children and adults, I know for a fact that I'm autistic. But to have that stamp of approval from a real doctor, I don't know. I guess it would be confirmation that I'm not just stupid or bad or whatever other, ugly thing I've been called. It would be acknowledgement for me, but maybe also redeeming in the eyes of those who have treated me the worst due to things I simply could not control. Maybe if they understood why I am the way I am, the real reason, they would see that I'm not the monster that they've grown to hate. I think my awkwardness also it 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 helps the perpetrators defame me, right? But I wouldn't dare bring this issue up with my doctor, about the autism, because with just my luck, given the current situation, I get stuck with an extremely ugly false diagnosis that would further discredit me to anyone I might go to for help, such as law enforcement and other doctors. Such is the case with so many undiagnosed autistics. Plus, they already administered a drug test when I tried to tell them about the stalking. The last thing I need is to do or say anything that might trigger more fears of illegal drug use. So, I don't expect to ever get a proper diagnosis, but at least now I know, with or without a doctor's note of approval, what is wrong with me, and what has been wrong all along. I wish I had known all along.